So as you just stated, 1986 MDMA was criminalized. That's ecstasy. And that was 15 years after the Controlled Substances Act was passed. Could you walk everybody through a little bit the perhaps the history in this country of drug laws? I know that I think the first drug laws were like in the 19-teens, was it?
Mm-hmm. Well, it kind of depends on how you characterize drug laws. So yes, if you look at just laws on the books that are criminalizing certain substances within the United States, then really we're actually looking back to the late 1800s with the Chinese Exclusion Act and Opium Acts that were pretty much directly targeted at Chinese migrants in the late 1800s that were here to build out the railroads. Shortly after, we have the well-known move to ban cannabis, which happened in the early 1930s. That was really focused around issues regarding the Mexican-American border and its use by Mexican people as well. And that's where you have the beginning of the Marijuana Tax Act and some of these things that started to soft criminalize some of these substances. And then you flash forward about another 30, 40 years later, you hit the 60s, the 70s, and by 1971, you get to the Controlled Substances Act, which kind of builds out the current scheme. It's important to put this in context, though. I think that for most of human history, these substances have been traded and not criminalized. So it was really a move that the United States pushed in the late 1800s that kind of slowly knocked over the dominoes of other countries that built out what's now an international drug control scheme that's enforced at the UN level and then at the country level. I would also even go back a little bit further and say that there is a significant influence in early colonization on these drug laws. So, for example, although we don't have laws on the books formally in the United States until the late 1800s, it's absolutely true that use of a lot of these substances, especially psychedelic ones in particular, sacred, ceremonial, traditional context use, was actually criminalized as early as the moment the Spanish landed or shortly after the Spanish landed in the quote-unquote New World. So we kind of see this legacy of colonization, which started by repressing these uses of substances early on, 400 plus 500 years ago, that then built out the groundwork for what would become the drug control scheme, which we know today.
Yeah, so just to underscore that point, because I think it's really important, and I think a lot of people don't know this, I think the assumption from a lot of people is like, well, maybe the way they came up with the drug laws is like a bunch of scientists and doctors got in a room and they said, hey, here are the ones that are too dangerous for consumption, here are the ones that are okay, so now we're going to create this scale based on that logic, and that is just nowhere near what actually happened, and like you pointed out, you had banning of opium was tied directly to anti-Chinese racism. This is a fact of history because, listen, from what I've read on it, you can tell me if I'm wrong. It's like the white families didn't want their daughters mingling with the Chinese in the opium dens because they felt like, oh, they're going to get taken advantage of or something. And then
You're basically not wrong.
And then you have like you said, marijuana was tied to anti-Mexican racism, criminalizing that. And then the Nixon White House with the war on drugs admitted, hey, the reason why we're doing this is really politics. We want to make sure that we criminalize the lifestyle of minorities and white hippies. So all this stuff is on the record. And when people see it, it really blows their mind.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah.
I was throwing it to you.
Well, I was going to ask you to elaborate, Ismail, on a little more of what you said. Like, with the Spanish colonizers, why did they care? And a lot of the drugs that they were fearful of or sought to eradicate or criminalize were psychedelics. Why did they care? Why were they concerned about this?
Yeah, so if you look at some of the early accounts of the Spanish, whether it was kind of colonizers that were there for economic reasons or they were there for religious reasons, there were a lot of people there that were there on behalf of the Catholic Church, in addition to the Spanish crown itself and other colonial powers as well. You kind of see this, there's a couple things that are happening at the same time. One is this really dramatic infantilization of the indigenous people that are here. And this idea, and you actually see you can find quotes that are like, they're just singing and playing. And, they have this idea that because they don't live in this hyper-industrialized society, or what Europe saw as getting closer to industrialized society in the 14 and 1500s. There was this sense that they were more primitive. They were savages. There's a lot of these terms that kind of are built out of those early days. So I believe that the perspective that kind of Spanish colonizers, the Catholic Church and others had to do with the idea that, oh, they're eating these substances, they have this relationship with nature, this is unnatural, or if it's natural, it's some earlier stage. So I think it has a lot to do with this concept that Christianity, that Europeanism, that all of these things were here to actually bring progress to the indigenous people, as if the indigenous people were somehow behind on some scale. So I think that the original criminalization of a lot of these substances and the repression of these practices, which then did lead to these practices being held underground or turning into kind of syncretic formats where they kind of meld with other formats of religion that were more permitted, came out of this idea that these practices were satanic or demonic, like this idea of communing with nature, of communing in community, separate, very different from the understanding of religion that especially the Catholic Church had, was seen as a threat. So you actually see what I would call like kind of a cultural chilling effect that was one of the results of this mass cultural genocide that occurred in the early 1600s, related to the use of these substances. And not just the use of these substances, obviously it's well documented that a number of practices, cultural practices and otherwise, were genocided or were significantly impacted by these early settlers. But on the topic of these substances in particular, that this was just one piece, communing around nature with, taking peyote or eating mushrooms or whatever. These are things that were seen as being kind of savage, old world paradigms that needed to change. So that's, I think, that early piece.
It also seems, Ismail, like just if you are trying to spread a particular religion, and especially if you're talking about the Catholic faith, which has to be like intermediated, you don't have this direct connect to the spiritual, this direct relationship with God. You look at this experience that people are having, you're like, this is a threat. How can we compete with this? Right? We got to get rid of this stuff because what we're offering here doesn't seem nearly as exciting.
That's a good
Definitely.
point.
Exactly.
Yeah, I never thought of that. I thought that was a great point. Yeah, because it's true. If somebody has a psychedelic experience, they really do feel like, oh my God, I touched God. Meanwhile, you go to a Catholic church and you just sit there and hear an old guy. Yeah, you hear an old guy tell a story that nobody relates to, and you're like,
you've got bureaucracy. You've got spiritual bureaucracy in some of these churches, and one of the things that these substances offer in certain cases is kind of a cutting out of that bureaucracy. It's like, nope, straight to the source. Let's get to it, which can, comes with all of its own implications. But I think that that's absolutely a factor. And at the time, for those of you that, for people that have that historical, knowledge, the Catholic Church was already in kind of a battle with the Protestant Church, right? There was this big kind of much larger arc that was happening in Europe to, exactly as you said, get the followers that they wanted and retain people. And of course, retaining people into spiritual practice and religion is something that goes on today. The difference is that now psychedelics are literally everywhere and they're harder to control.
Yeah. I mean, if you have a direct connection, personal connection to the spiritual, I can see how people would think that was a very dangerous thing, right? Because then you're harder to control. You feel like you have your own access to these things. It doesn't have to be intermediated through someone else.
Yeah. Any religion that feels like it sort of makes intuitive sense to people, I feel like religions like Christianity felt extra threatened by that. You know what I mean? Because it's like you said, they sort of have an advantage. If somebody's worshiping aspects of nature, I see how that makes sense. If somebody's having psychedelic experiences and you feel like you're touching God, it's like, I see why somebody would feel more religious after that. But like I said, growing up, I grew up in the Catholic Church, and at no point did I feel any sort of connection to anything interesting, holy, whatever. And, so anyway, interesting point.
Speaks to some people, didn't it? Yeah, my mom was a nun and didn't speak to us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, quite literally.
I love this topic because my mother was also Catholic and I was raised Muslim. And actually this whole arc. Yeah, there's this whole arc for me personally around how psychedelics kind of pulled me away from religion and then brought me back. And there's a whole story. And it's true for a lot of people, I think, who, as you said, like suddenly get contact with some sort of divine or mystical experience, as they say in the clinical studies. And then suddenly it affects their worldview in whatever way.